you awake out there? Okay, now we have a fantastic guest this evening, Andrew Charlton, who's, well, unfeasibly young, irritatingly impressive, erudite, and great to listen to. So we'll be hearing from Andrew on the future of the unknown. Perhaps inspired by Donald Rumsfeld, I'm not sure, Andrew. The unknown unknowns. I'm sure he'll deal with that, but he promises that he will do two things tonight. He will reliably drift from the topic to talk about the quagmire that is Canberra and what passes for politics in this country.
I'd like to thank the Ngara Institute for the invitation to speak to you tonight. I was all set up to talk about the future of work, which we will, but it's been a big week in Canberra. I was in Canberra on Tuesday. It was chilly down there, and it was sad down there. It reminded me of a day in 2010 that I've had a lot of therapy to try and avoid thinking about. I worked for Kevin Rudd through the global financial crisis and into 2010, and then one night in 2010, I was having a beer upstairs in the office of Craig Emerson and Martin Ferguson, and I was watching the 7 o'clock news. It was 7 o'clock at night, and onto the news came the story, that footage of our office, and the story that Julie Gillard had just walked into our office to challenge the Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd. This was news to me. It was happening beneath our feet on the first floor of the ministerial wing of Parliament House, and you know, the rest is history. The next morning, in the party room, the leader was changed. A trip to the Governor General, the Prime Minister was changed. The history moves on. My office was all out of jobs. So it was with a little bit of sadness that I was down in Canberra on Tuesday watching this occur again. And you know that since that time in 2010 and this Tuesday, it's happened a few times. And I want to give you one statistic that I think speaks volumes about Australian politics and how it's changed. I'm 39. I went to work for Kevin Rudd in December 2007. In my life up to that point, what do you think the average number of years that an Australian Prime Minister was in office for?
About 6.
About 6? Any? I got an 8. I've got a 15. 7.2. So everyone's very close, except the person who said 15. 7.2 years. 7.2 years was the average time in my life that an Australian Prime Minister had been in office. That was December 2007. It's now 2018. Anyone want to hazard a guess at the average amount of time that an Australian Prime Minister has been in office since
in the last
2007?
18 months.
I've got an 18 months. 2 years. Yeah, 25 months. So this is a big change. Since John Howard in 2004 was the last Prime Minister to start a term that Prime Minister would finish. That's a big change. And I didn't come here tonight to talk about this, but it is significant. Something else that happened this week in Canberra, which got lost in the news, is two big policies went down. One was the National Energy Guarantee, the NEG as it's affectionately called by some, and the second one was company tax cuts. Now, you will all have views on the NEG and you'll all have views on company tax cuts. Well, you'll all have views on the NEG. And whatever you think of those policies, that is the core of this government's agenda in climate change and in economics. And this week, as well as the Prime Minister facing a challenge and maybe not lasting out the week, the government's agenda went down. And I raise this because I think it's not insignificant and not unconnected to the volatility of Australian politics. We used to have volatility in Australian politics. I don't want to pretend that everything was placid. Everyone was friendly and there were kumbayas in the parliament and shaking hands across the tables. It wasn't. But we used to have at least one of two things. In Australian politics, we used to have either stability or reform. We had periods of great stability, and we had periods where there wasn't a lot of stability, but there was a lot of reform, a lot of things getting done. And in the last 10 years, the problem is exemplified by what happened in the last week with the challenge to Malcolm Turnbull and the dropping of the NEG and the company tax cuts, is that we have neither. We have neither stability nor reform. And so I want to ask you this question. Why? What has changed? Why have we gone from... It's not a rhetorical question. I am going to take your answer. We have gone from a period of incredible... a period of Australia's democracy being in health. As I say, not always stable, not always reform, but often one of the two. Most of the time, one of the two. To a period where we have neither. Why? Why? Two reasons. Here.
The first, my name is Charlton. The first reason is an incredibly long strategic development, principally affecting the coalition parties. Let me summarise.
I'm going to repeat it after you. Actually, why don't you come here and I'll give you the mic.
I'll do that.
Be brief.
Thank you, Andrew.
Be brief.
Thank you. The first is a structural reason. About 30 years, the infestation of particularly right-wing parties by evangelical Christians in particular, such that their party members are conviction-driven, increasingly narrow, and increasingly fewer. That party depends enormously, as Giovanni Rhodes said on ABC Radio this morning, on handing out powder votes, supplying a little money, and providing attendance in branch meetings. That's the first reason. The second reason is one that I'm having trouble remembering, to be quite honest.
You think. I'll give the mic back to you. No, I think the first reason is a good reason. Extremism in politics. I'm going to summarise, probably you're going to disagree with my summary.
Oh, I've got the second reason.
I'm going to be very...
Sorry about that. The second reason is the other side of politics. The exemplification of Blairite perspective within the Labor Party, enshrined by Hawke. The best example I know is the introduction of HEX, indefensible. That was continued by Rudd.
Problems with both sides of politics. Sure. I think that there's a lot in that. I would summarise the reasons that people give, and please shout out if you've got more. People blame the leaders. People say one of the reasons why politics has been so bad over the last 10 years is we've had dud leaders. Another reason people say that nothing gets done is that all the big reforms have been done. The big reforms were done in the 80s and 90s, and now the problems are smaller. I don't agree with either of those two theses, but those are the two of the theses you hear about a lot.
The short news cycle.
Short news cycle is a good one. Changes in the way that politicians have to respond to that.
Governments become irrelevant. Corporations rule the world.
Corporations rule the world.
Senate.
Senate.
Senate vote.
Sure, Senate, but we've always had a Senate. Something's changed in the Senate. Why?
Personality politics.
Personality politics. Sure. Utopian politics.
Demise of unions.
What was that?
I think reactivity to polls and
Reactivity to polls.
like a big Facebook page.
Yeah, sure.
Populism.
Populism.
Demise of unions.
Demise of unions. Yep.
I think there's a sense, hard to have a sense of direction in a situation where there's increasing complexity. And that complexity is increasing because there's so much more interaction between various parts of our political whole, such that it's very difficult to establish a real sense of direction in which we get there.
Yeah. Government's harder. Yep. More complex. I agree with that. Westminster system no longer serves us. Member of the Greens up the back. Anyone else?
Majority of Australians don't care.
Apathy. Sure.
Yeah.
Yep.
Let's throw in
Big money
corruption.
lobby groups, especially minerals.
You guys are on the same page. Corruption and big money lobby groups. Sure. I'll throw back a challenge to lots of those questions. They've been around for a long time. Maybe they've changed a bit. They've been around for a long time. What's really new? What's caused this sharp discontinuity?
The internet.
The internet? The media? Maybe. Yeah.
Trumpism.
Trumpism? Yeah. Yeah. We, what's that? Fear. Yeah. People are more anxious, worried that their lives are going to be worse than their parents' lives, probably for the first time in many generations. Yeah. Look, I think there's a lot in all those answers. I'm going to give you another answer, which isn't inconsistent with anything that we've already heard. But the beginning of that answer is, I don't think that politicians are duds. I think that, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, God help us, Peter Dutton. I'm not sure that saying that that crop of people are duds is the right answer. I don't think it's right, and even if it was, I don't think it would be the answer. I think there is something deep and structural going on which has changed the way politics works. And I am going to get back to the topic that was advertised at the end of this. And what I think has changed is the nature of governing Australia. And what I mean by that is, to be, the essence of being in government is presenting a vision, and around that vision you can bring together 51+% of the population. That's almost the definition of politics becoming a government. Presenting a vision and getting 51+% of the population to agree to that vision and walk into the polling booth and vote for it. And in Australia, we have had two different ways to deliver that majority. There was a right-wing path and a left-wing path. And both of those, the nature of cobbling together that 51% is the process of coalition building. This is what politicians do. They build coalitions around ideas to get to 51%. That's their job. And on the right of politics, on the conservative side of politics, we had a very, whatever you think of it, we had a very successful and stable formula for delivering that 51%. That formula was Menzies' child. Menzies recognised that one way to build a big coalition was to create a broad tent where he would call the Conservative Party the Liberal Party. He would unite traditional conservatives, social conservatives with economic conservatives, economic liberals as they've come to be called, and with that coalition, you build a big enough tent, get enough people into the tent, get 51% and win government. And that formula worked. It worked for Menzies for a long time. It worked for Fraser. It worked for Howard. Putting together that coalition worked. Flip over to the other side of politics. The left-wing side of politics. The Labor Party rose in the early 20th century, became an electoral force in the second decade of the 20th century. Started to wane a little bit as its traditional base of working class voters became a smaller proportion of the population relative to the middle class. So to create that coalition, it needed to be reinvented, and who reinvented it? Whitlam. He recognised that the old traditional working class was shrinking as a proportion of the population. If the Labor Party wanted to get to 51%, if they wanted to build a big coalition, they couldn't just rely anymore on the working class. They needed to appeal to the middle class. Whitlam was perfect to do that. Good private schoolboy called the Comrade. Perfect figure to unite those two groups. He identified the growing middle class. He appealed to the middle class through new issues, environmentalism, multiculturalism. Handily for him, the new middle class lived in the same electorates as the old working class, as Paddington and Randwick and Glebe and Balmain all gentrified. And he put together that coalition, got to 51%. Hawke and Keating used that coalition, the traditional working class, the inner city urbanites, put them together, got a coalition, worked. Rudd did the same thing, put that coalition together, it worked. So we have two coalitions delivering Australia stable politics in the Westminster system. Two successful coalitions delivering government over the long term. Uniting people around ideas and being able to prosecute those ideas, and those, another word for that is delivering reform. So we have stability and we have reform. So, what has gone wrong in the last 10 years? Well, one answer, and I'm not discounting any of the other things that people have said because I think there's truth in all of them, but one answer to throw on the table is that those coalitions are breaking down. The two big coalitions that delivered us stable government for most of the last century are breaking down. Let me give you an example. Well, the examples all around you with the Liberals. They've got the Conservatives going in one direction and the economic Liberals going in the other direction. On issue after issue, they are being torn to shreds. That coalition which Menzies built, Howard sustained, is breaking apart. Poor old Malcolm Turnbull almost can't do anything without offending one or either side of his party, and so he's been able to deliver almost nothing. I work for the Labor Party, let me be equally critical of that side of politics. That coalition is breaking down. Think of the issues that we tried to work on. Climate change. The two parts of the coalition had different views on climate change. One part of the coalition wanted to save the planet, the other part of the coalition wanted to save on their power bills. The differences between the traditional Labor voter and the new urban middle class were stark. Issue after issue, immigration, asylum seekers, education, same-sex marriage. The coalitions that have delivered stability to Australian politics are breaking down on both sides of politics. And what it means is, you've got a leader like Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull. They're trying to put that 51% together, trying to create a vision that can unite 51% of the people at least. But they're standing on either side of tectonic plates that are moving apart. And so they can't get that vision that unites their coalition. And you know what happens when your coalition starts to split apart? Well, people start to pick off little pieces of the coalition. little pieces of the coalition over here and the social conservatives, suddenly they're looking at their leader in the right wing and saying, well, actually that person's not representing me so much anymore. They haven't said much that I like. And they're ripe to be pulled off by Pauline Hanson, Corey Bernardi, Peter Dutton. On the left-hand side, there are lots of those voters who are now looking at the Labor Party and going, well, you know what, those people haven't said a lot that I like recently. They are ripe to be picked off by the Greens, other left-wing parties who are focusing more specifically on their issues, giving them a purer diet of what they care about. And so we've got this environment where the coalitions are splitting apart, they're atomising, and that's fertile ground for what we call populists or minor parties, or I don't want to offend any Greens here, but the minor parties who are giving a purer ideological message. They don't need to get to 51%, they don't need to appeal to everyone. They're just laser focused on their bit of the constituency and giving them a stronger message. So that is a powerful electoral tactic, and it's working. Let me give you another fact. In the last federal election, what proportion of voters in the upper house in Australia voted for a minor party? 30? 33%. 1 in 3. Westminster system, 1 in 3 voters in Australia walked into the ballot box, voted for a party that was not going to form government. We used to call that a protest vote. I don't think we call it a protest vote anymore. We used to call it a protest vote. Now we call it a minor party vote. In the House of Representatives, it was 1 in 4, 25%. Now, that to me is that number, the proportion of Australians walking into the ballot box and casting their vote for a party that cannot form government is, we used to call it a protest vote, now I don't care what you call it, but I'll tell you what it is. It is a blinking light on our democracy. It is a barometer of the health of our democracy. Of course it's a barometer on the major parties, of course it's a barometer on the Westminster system. It is a barometer on our politics. And at 25%, how many times in Australia's history do you think it's been that high? Who wants to hazard a stab at this? I went to pub, I might as well do a quiz. Who wants to, what's that? Never? No, not never. 4 or 5. I'm gonna average you and make you both the winners. 3. 3 times the protest vote, whatever you want to call it, has been above 25% in the House of Representatives since Federation. Now, here's the stat. Each of those 3 times that the protest vote went above 25%, 1 in 4 or more Australians didn't want to vote for one of the major parties. Each time that particular warning light blinked red on the dashboard of Australian politics, one of the 2 major parties didn't survive.
Yes. Yes.
In the first time, you get different reactions. Depends where you are. Didn't go down so well in the LP party room. The first time was in the beginning of the 20th century. The 2 major parties were the Free Traders and the Protectionists. They dominated Australian politics. The rise of the Labor Party got more than 25% of the vote, caused those parties, the Free Traders and the Protectionists, to merge and form the antecedent to current Conservative parties in Australia. They were called the Conservative Party for a time. That was the first time. The second time was in the early 1930s in the Lang Labor split. And the third time was in the early 1940s, associated with the destruction of the United Australia Party. 3 times in Australian history, that warning light on Australia's democracy has blinked red above 25%. Each of those times, one of the major parties didn't survive, and this is the 3rd time. Yeah, you can suggest that. You can suggest that. Yeah.
Why they both go?
What?
Because the electorate is actually split.
Yeah. You can take that view. Yeah, that's a very legitimate view. not healthy for the major parties, but you can take the view that it's healthy for democracy. So other people might have a different view. I think they're both legitimate. So we're in a period of flux. We're in a period where these coalitions are breaking down. That means when your coalition breaks down, it's very hard for the leader to lead. When it's hard for the leader to lead, they look weak. Doesn't matter how good they are. When they look weak, the electorate turns on them because neither side of the coalition is happy, and you get this churn. And all the other points that were raised earlier are all part of it, I think. The media, disillusionment, inequality, all of those complexity, all those things are part of that change. But just from the perspective of practical politics, putting together 51% of the population around an idea and forming a government from that, that is getting harder for that reason of arithmetic, that reason of structure. Now, this is a slightly tenuous link, but hopefully not too tenuous. Back to the topic of the night, future of work. I think that one of the reasons that these coalitions are breaking down is because of a deep structural force. Technology is changing the way that we live, changing the way that we work. And it's changing the way that we live and work in ways that I think put pressure on those coalitions. Globalisation, technological progress, innovation. Think about the Labour coalition. These are forces which generate opportunity for part of that coalition. If you're living in the fancy suburbs, if you've got the jobs in finance, jobs in tech, these are forces that are yielding you opportunities. If you're in the part of the economy, maybe some of the traditional parts of the economy, these are forces which are reducing your job security. These are forces which are putting downward pressure on your wages. Similarly, on the conservative side of politics, these same trends in the social sphere. Globalisation, forces that are running between the two parts of the coalition and dividing them. So that's why I think the way that we deal with these technologies is really important. It matters for our economy, it matters for inequality, it matters for the jobs that young people have, that they're going to get, their training, their education, but it also matters a lot for our democracy. If we allow these forces to continue to divide us, to create haves and have-nots, to increase the job security of some and reduce the job security of others, that feeds into the politics of the day. That creates a febrile environment, a disillusionment, a disengagement. And I think that's part of what we're witnessing in Canberra is a result of some of those deep forces that are dividing us. So, what are those deep forces, and how do we turn that around? There's no question that job prospects are changing. Over the last 25 years, Australia has had enormous change in our labour market. You think about roles like administrative assistants and secretaries. We've lost 400,000 jobs in those two categories over the last 25 years, as computers just sweep through offices and displace a lot of that secretarial clerical work. In what we used to call blue-collar roles, we've lost nearly 100,000 labouring jobs, nearly 150,000 machine operation jobs. And don't get me wrong, we've created jobs on the other side. We've had unemployment is not much higher than it was. We'll talk about underemployment and other things, but we've also created a ton of jobs as well. We've created 800,000 new jobs over the last 25 years in the care industries, in childcare, education, healthcare, disability care. We've created 250,000 jobs in professional services. So we've had enormous change in the labour market. But there's been something about that change, which is driving some of those forces of divergence that we were talking about. And some of that change is, for some people it's been very positive, and for others it's been very negative. And we haven't been good at supporting the people for whom that change has been negative. So how do we do a better job of that? Well, I think there are roles for everyone. I think there are roles for government, there are roles for business, and I think there are also roles for individuals. We need to rethink what we value as work. There's no fundamental reason why someone who works in financial services should be paid a lot more than someone who works in childcare. I'm an economist. There's no law of economics that dictates there should be such a difference there. And yet there is. We've had huge growth in the care, in employment in the care, but there's been relatively lower wage growth, and huge growth in financial services, which has been relatively higher wage growth. How do we rethink the structures, cultures that cause that divergence and try and get more equity into our jobs? I think that's a big challenge. There's something about that, about many of those jobs that are growing in the care sector, they're public sector jobs. There's a lot of pressure on the public sector to reduce costs. That flows through to wage restraint in that area, despite it creating a lot of jobs. No such restraint in other parts of the economy. So how do we rethink what we value as work? And this is where I'm going to be optimistic. I think that the growth of robotics, artificial intelligence, automation has the potential to really change the way we think about work. It's not a new problem, dealing with these forces of change. They've been around for a long time, but we are reaching something of a tipping point. That change, I would argue, for most of our history has been really positive. Technology has made work better. For 10,000 years, at the start of the invention of agriculture, work for humans was hard. Work for humans was very physical, hard labour. Agriculture was hard work. Humans have shifted from the more physical tasks, the more routine tasks, into the more creative, interpersonal and cognitive tasks. Work has changed, and I think in some ways that change has been positive. Looking forward 100 years, there are people who are very pessimistic. They say artificial intelligence will be able to do everything humans do but better. Robots will be better at every job than humans. Elon Musk told us last year that there will be no human jobs left. Nothing that a computer or a robot can't do better than you, your children, your grandchildren. There will be no work. I would fundamentally challenge that. I think that is true if you stop the clock on what work means today. Yes, a lot of the tasks that we currently call work will be done by machines. But why do we have to have a static definition of work? Why can't we find new ways as humans to deliver value to each other? Redefine what we mean by work, which we've been doing since the dawn of time. Why can't we now take the promise of technology and turn it into progress in the way that we work? To get more people into work which is meaningful, interpersonal, creative, cognitive, the type of tasks and skills that humans do well. And less people into the type of tasks that machines do well. The dirty, dull and dangerous tasks, the pulling, the lifting, the labouring tasks. I think there's an opportunity to rethink what work means in a way that makes work liberating, exciting, valuable, for future generations. But it's going to require a shift in what work means and a shift in what we value in work. And I think that's a conversation we need to start to have. To bring this back to the politics, I think unless we have that conversation about what work is, how it's driving inequality, it's going to be very hard to fix our politics. I don't think we can look at our politicians and hope that the situation is going to get better. I don't think that it's going to improve under Malcolm Turnbull or Peter Dutton or whoever else becomes the next leader or Prime Minister. I think these challenges are deep and they're going to affect our politics for a long time. And pointing at Canberra and saying, you guys need to get your act together, wishing that we go back to the great era of reform, hoping that we're one great leader away from getting back to good politics. All we need to do is wait for the next Hawkey. I think that's naive. I don't think we'll fix our politics in Canberra until we fix these deep issues in our community and our economy. And some of those issues are very challenging and will require us to change the way we think about work, pay, value, and community. And that's a journey that we can't solve in Canberra. It's a journey you have to solve in neighbourhoods, in communities, in forums, thinking about what we care about, what we value. And that's a big challenge. I'm going to stop there, but we're going to flip into questions. So we'd love to talk about any of the vast terrain that we have trampled over in this short session.
Is the human psyche, in your opinion, capable of that next step, looking to what history has shown us about the human being?
Yeah, good question. Look, yeah, I think so. I think humans are incredibly adaptable. Like, you think about the changes in our lifetime, let alone the changes over many generations. Who would have thought that? Imagine our forebears, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents looking at us here on our smartphones, doing what we do, spending the day the way we spend the day. Humans have been incredibly adaptable, and if I think about what drives humans, I agree with you. Driven by tribalism. I think that there's an extent to which humans are tribal beings and driven by a desire for relativities. They care about relativities, each other, groups, communities. They have a deep empathy, particularly towards those people who are close to them. That's a nature of the human condition. They crave recognition. I think all of those things are consistent with changes in the way that we work towards much better work enabled by technology that is more meaningful, more creative, more engaging. And so yes, I think humans would not just adapt to it, they would be happier, more satisfied, more fulfilled in the work that they do.
You're right.
Ngara is about positive solutions, so I wondered if you'd speak about part-time work, cooperatives and universal basic income.
Yeah. Look, part-time work is fantastic to the extent that it is what the people who do it want to do. The issue of the future of work's been around for a long time. John Maynard Keynes, very famous economist, in the 1920s, made one of the boldest, best-known predictions about the future of work. And his prediction was that the consequence of machines coming into the home and the work was going to be that all of us now in the 21st century would be swamped with leisure time. No one would work full-time. We would work 8 hours a week. That hasn't come to pass for most people. We still work long hours. Australians, by and large, still work long hours. And why do they do that? Well, a couple of reasons. One is, they live in a consumerist, materialist, relative world, and people choose, they're competitive. They want to work to enhance their living standards above what, Keynes might have thought was necessary or even possible. And secondly, we live very differently to the way Keynes lived. We actually have a lot of leisure in our lives. We spend a lot more time as young people out of work in education. We live a lot longer, spend a lot more time in retirement than we did 100 years ago. So we actually do have a lot more leisure in our lives. We just don't consume it in the way that Keynes expected, by all working 8 hours a week for our whole lives. We consume it by working quite hard at a period of our life and then having other parts of our lives where we work less. Which brings me to universal basic income. Look, I think this is an idea that has a lot of positives. And those positives are going to be well known to everyone in this room. Simplification of the welfare system, potentially a reduction in inequality depending on the way it's designed. I'll give some drawbacks as well, though, and these aren't reasons to oppose the UBI, but they're things to think about as you support it and design it. I worry a bit that the universal basic income isn't being ambitious enough for humans. That we have the potential to the extent that some people, not everyone, but to the extent that some people propose UBI as a solution to joblessness, I think that's the wrong reason to promote UBI. I think we should be tackling joblessness. And to get back to what I was saying before, I think that by changing what we mean by work, changing what we value, valuing different things, valuing more ways that humans give each other value, they create value for each other, do work for each other, is a more ambitious way to think about the future of work than giving everyone the same amount of money to be jobless. So my problem with UBI in the way some people frame it is I think it doesn't give humans enough credit to be able to get out of a jobless future and create new types of engaging, exciting and positive work, and the creation of that work to be the focus of policymakers, not the payment for joblessness.
Back to politics here. Back to politics. What would be so wrong with the collapse of the two-party system and the coalition split into three with the Nationals and Malcolm leads the Wets and Tony Abbott leads the Dry and Charlton leads the Labor union movement and Albo leads the inner city Liberals and the other side issue parties still continue on? What would be wrong with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not going to suggest there'd be anything wrong with it, but I do take your point. There are lots of options for an alternative to a two-party system, or at least the two-party system we have now. One of those options is a German option where you have grand coalitions being built. One option, which probably not a great option, is the Italian option, where the left and the right, the extremes on the left and the extremes on the right, both become so powerful that they actually end up dominating politics and forming a bizarre coalition of the left and right extremes. You got the American model, where one of the major parties is just taken over by a populist and dragged into a completely new space of economic illiberalism and social conservatism. You've got the Irish model. You've got the Corbyn UK model. I think there are lots of ways that you can imagine, if the two-party system breaks down in Australia, that it could break. And you can imagine positives and negatives around each of those.
I'd like to throw one mechanism that you rose earlier, and that is, how do you achieve your 51%?
Yeah, well, in these countries, you achieve it in different ways. In
Australia.
Yeah, in the world that the gentleman was describing, it would involve smaller coalitions of different groups coming together, the way that many of the Scandinavian countries do, or the Germans do.
The actual coalition that I think would win would be Malcolm would join with Albanese's, and that would be, I think, would form a 51%, it would seem.
Yeah, that is certainly not. What you're describing is a flipping of the axis of Australian politics. That's not so crazy. Australian politics has existed on this Labor capital axis, what we call left-right, the Labor Party and the Conservative parties. What you're describing is a flip from that axis being the main axis to a global nationalist axis. And frankly, we've had that before. We were talking about the early part of the 20th century earlier tonight. The main axis of Australian politics wasn't Labor and capital, it was internationalists versus nationalists. The two major parties in Australia were the protectionists and the free traders. And that's the type of axis that you're describing. It would be a huge, I don't want to underestimate, I don't want to predict this because it would be a huge change, but that is another axis. And I think that's kind of the axis, frankly, that American politics is starting to orbit around. Nationalists versus internationalists. Maybe even that some European countries are starting to orbit around.
Andrew, thank you for some very interesting insights. I'm interested in the conversation you say we need to have. Is there anywhere in the world that's having this conversation in a constructive way? Yeah. And if so, are any of them coming up with good answers?
Yeah, great question. I think there are lots of countries that are starting to rethink what work means, and at its heart, the reason why I think that people need to lead it, not politicians, is that it's a values question. What do we value? I hope that we think deeply about what we value and are prodded to do so by the rise of automation, which takes away a lot of the things that we used to say we value, to make us think more about what we do value now. I think the way that some of this, to answer your question, the way that some of this is playing out is thinking about the future of the labour market. In a world where work is very different, maybe it's more kind of a gig economy type world. How do we regulate that to make sure people are supported well? How do we provide people with flexibility in those environments if flexibility is important to them, and make sure that they're not exploited? So there are lots of conversations going on around the world around those real questions today. But I think, as I said, I think the essence of this is actually people solving the problem by changing the way they think about work and what they value.
It seems the way we're talking, we're a kind of work-centric society. We're jobs. Much work is done that isn't a job. There's lots of unpaid work is done, hard work in the home, family, volunteering aside. A lot of work is done by volunteers, unpaid labour, in other words. So surely we need to shift that axis, if you like. The idea that you're only a human being or a citizen is if you've got a job. The first thing they ask you in cultured society, or particularly, what do you do? To validate yourself as a human being, you must have a job. And our jobs, as you're saying, jobs are disappearing. What happens then? So that's this work-centric society issue, and that's what I'd like to discuss.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, you've just made my point more eloquently than I did, obviously not very well, because I think that's a lot of that is what I think is really important. It's changing what we value, and changing what we value from being a 9-to-5 job in a particular industry doing a particular task to saying, actually, there are many ways that humans deliver value to each other, including many of the examples you gave, things that we currently don't call work, but are ways that humans create value for each other. And that's what I'm talking about. That's what we've got to start to value. And some of those things we do call jobs, we don't pay anywhere near enough. And some of those things we don't even call jobs. And some of those things we don't even call work. So he's thinking about how we get away from the concept. As I said, if we think of work as a static definition of today's jobs, then yes, machines are going to take over all those jobs. If we think of work in an expansive sense of how do humans deliver value to each other, including all the things you mentioned, then I think there will always be work. We just have to value it differently.
When you look at the kids today, they're all constantly on the internet. How about a form of government coming where everybody voted on every individual question? So any government body that had something to offer from any party could put it up, and then everyone in the whole country gets to vote, and if they feel incompetent in that particular area, they can say, well, I'm going to give this person my vote because they understand this. What do you think about that?
Yeah, look, I think there is lots of very exciting democratic innovation going on, including lots of platforms for direct democracy. There are a number of great initiatives all around the world being explored. The one that I love is there's a New Zealand artificial intelligent politician, and is the first artificial intelligence politician who is a robot and speaks for the people. So he, she, it listens to every interaction and responds to those and puts them forward as updates the policy positions based on all the interactions. So there is a ton of innovation. Nick Gruen, one of Australia's great thinkers, has an idea which I think has a lot of merit. He says the solution to our democratic problems is to go back to old technology, and the technology he likes is, he calls sortition, but it's really the Roman system of getting rid of professional politicians and replacing those professional politicians with randomly drawn people from the community. Nick will make the point that we like that system in jurisprudence. That's, we have that for juries. If that system was applied more generally across other issues, think about climate change. Nick's solution to climate change would be, well, let's take it away from the Liberal Party and the Labor Party, let's randomly select some Australians, give them access to and term limit them, so they don't. So you're not a politician for life. You're a politician at random, by surprise, for a fixed period. Provide those people with information and support, and see what they come up with. So look, there are lots of different democratic innovations out there. I think some of them are technology enabled, some of them are just different, and I think there's lots of scope there.
Given the fact that we may be in the Anthropocene age, as people are talking about quietly all around the world, I've got a personal question to ask you. If it matters nothing, can you tell us what happened with Kevin Rudd? I've read his books. Can you tell us what really brought down Kevin?
How is that related to the Anthropocene?
The disillusionment, given that he's given standing ovations all over the world and no one can understand why we got rid of him.
Yeah. Look, politics is a hard game. That's a very banal statement. You're witnessing it right now. Why are we getting rid of Malcolm Turnbull? Why did we get rid of Tony Abbott? Why did we get rid of Julia Gillard? Why did we get rid of Kevin Rudd? I don't think any of that churn is a positive thing. I guess what I've been arguing tonight is it wasn't about Kevin, it wasn't about Julia, it wasn't maybe even about Tony. This is a period that we live in which creates a lot of volatility. Wouldn't matter who the Prime Minister was. It's just a very volatile period because the coalitions that those leaders are trying to lead are atomizing. And when you're trying to be a leader, but the coalition beneath you is breaking into pieces, it's very hard to stay in power. So yeah, that's That's the answer I give you. You do not look satisfied by that answer.
It was just a rat fuck a bit because actually China really did the dirty in that huge big meeting over there.
In Copenhagen? Yeah, so, well, I was in the room in Copenhagen. I was negotiating Australia's position in Copenhagen. I flew there 4 times. And that's a question I can try and answer for you. You know, why did we screw up Copenhagen? I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how I screwed it up. You know, as I said, I flew to Copenhagen 4 times just before that summit, and it was the summit to save the world. We all knew what we were there for. There was a draft agreement. The Danes, the Danish government was the chair of the what they call a COP, Conference of Parties, and they knew they were going to deliver the solution to the biggest problem on the planet. And they had a draft agreement. And we flew over, we had one look at the draft agreement, everyone commented, went home, flew back over, had a look at the revised agreement, looked good. All the stuff that all the NGOs, well, not all the stuff, most of the stuff all the NGOs would have wanted. 2 degrees, 400 parts per million, lots of aid, big commitments, all in there, all in the draft agreement. High five, go home, Kevin, come over, it's going to be great. The agreement's already done, shake hands, save the world. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. And we flew back to Copenhagen, night of the agreement, last night of the agreement. There's been no progress because it's the UN and the UN doesn't make any progress, but everyone knew that. So 14 days, first 13 wasted, but that was fine, everyone expected that. Last night, call on the mobile phone, 10 o'clock, come to this meeting, we're going to get out of the UN process, the Danes have convened the 20 countries that matter. We arrive in this room, it looks a bit like a school classroom. Kevin Rudd sitting there, Angela Merkel, Barack Obama, Nicolas Sarkozy, President of France at the time, Hillary Clinton was sitting behind Obama, and the agreement gets whipped out. Everyone knew how this rolls from here. We had been to these type of meetings before. We'd been to the G20. We'd been to all the trade agreements. The big meeting with all the countries, 200 countries, yaks on, nothing happens, and then the 20 countries that matter get into the room, the United States in the chair, make some agreement, everyone else tinkers with it, deal done. That was the script. That was what was going to happen. We knew it. We'd already seen the agreement. So why did it not happen in Copenhagen? Well, we made a massive mistake in that we assumed that everyone agreed with us. We assumed that the poor countries agreed with the rich countries. We had dozens of meetings with all the NGOs encouraging us to put all this stuff into the agreement. All of the NGOs, I remember walking into you couldn't walk through an airport in the end of 2009, beginning of 2010 without seeing all the posters of the NGOs. You know, they had photos of all the leaders. What will your grandchildren say if you don't sign this agreement? Photos of Rudd, photos of Sarkozy, photos of Merkel, photos of Obama. What will your grandchildren say? The NGOs had this huge, 100,000 people in the streets of Copenhagen, all protesting. We were responsive. We were hoping to deliver what they wanted. What we didn't factor in was the poor countries were on a fundamentally different page. The poor countries, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, the coalition of African states, they were on a fundamentally different page. We live in Australia, we've been made rich by putting a ton of crap into the atmosphere. We were all ready to say, let's stop that now. And the poor countries were like, hang on. You're telling us that we need to reduce our emissions? 30% of the world doesn't have electricity. And you're telling us we need to reduce our emissions? You guys have Earth Hour, where you turn the lights off for an hour. In my country, every hour is Earth Hour. And you're telling us we need to reduce our emissions? You got rich by industrialising, but we can't? That's what they said to us across the table. They hadn't been invited to the first 3 meetings of Copenhagen. They were there at the last meeting, and they said no. And outside, all the NGOs are protesting, you know, go Kevin Rudd, sign that agreement, go Angela Merkel, sign that agreement. They were there, they had their pens out. That's what they were there for. And the poor countries said, you guys want to save the planet, we just want to save ourselves. We've got hundreds of millions of people in our country living on less than $1 a day, without access to anywhere near enough energy. Our objective is to triple, quadruple the amount of energy consumed by our populations because they're incredibly poor and they need that energy. And for the first time in any global meeting I had seen, witnessed, been to, the poor countries stood up as a bloc and said no. And that was a change in the global dynamics of power. India was big enough. China had reached a point where they were willing to flex their muscle for the first time. And those poor countries got together and said no. And that was what we missed, and what, in my view, what we still miss in climate talks. And yeah, of course, in Australia, of course, the argument is between climate deniers and people who want to do climate action. I mean, that's so ludicrous, and of course the climate deniers are crazy, of course. But unfortunately, that's not the global debate. The global debate isn't between the climate deniers and the climate activists. The global debate is between the people who want to save the world and the people who want to save themselves. And putting on emissions caps, telling poor people they have to reduce their energy use is not the solution to that problem. The solution to that problem is the opposite. They want to make energy cheaper. They want to get more energy in the hands of more people. That's their objective. So if you want a global climate deal, if you actually want to do something about climate change, you have to solve that problem. And fortunately, lots of people are working on it. How, you know, the answer to that problem is, how do you make clean energy cheaper and more available than dirty energy? That's the solution to the problem. Not emissions trading schemes, not, well, those things can help in rich countries, but they're not the global solution. The global solution is providing cheaper energy to more people that is clean. And that is a hard problem. That is not a solution we have today, but it's a solution lots of people are working on.
Look, thank you, Andrew, for an incredibly erudite, illuminating, fascinating discussion, and for alerting us to those conversations that we need to have. I particularly liked your final answer, and for clarifying that for me and for everybody else in this audience, and thank you. And I think the other thing too is thank you for drawing our attention to the erosion of public trust in Australia, particularly in our democratic institutions and our political leaders.